Mad Dog Coll, the Irish killer who castrated 11 Italian lieutenants and mailed the parts to their wives. On the morning of February 8, 1932, a postal inspector in the Bronx opened a package that had been flagged by the sorting facility. The box, wrapped in brown butcher paper and tied with twine, bore no return address. Inside, packed in ice and sawdust, was a human testicle preserved in formaldehyde. Attached to the jar with a piece of string was a handwritten note on expensive stationery. It read, "Your husband died a coward. He begged like a woman. Now he is one." The note was signed with a single initial, V. Over the next 72 hours, 10 more packages arrived at addresses across Manhattan, the Bronx, and Brooklyn. Each contained the same grotesque cargo. Each bore a similar note, variations on a theme of emasculation and shame. The wives who received them, women married to soldiers in the Castellamarese crime family, did not go to the police. They went to their husbands' bosses, and their bosses went to war. This is not a story about a psychopath who happened to be Irish in an Italian underworld. This is a story about what happens when shame becomes a weapon more powerful than bullets. When a man weaponizes humiliation so completely that an entire criminal infrastructure reorganizes itself around the singular goal of erasing him from existence. This is the story of Vincent Mad Dog Coll, who understood that in a culture built on honor and fear, there are violations worse than murder. And this is the story of how that understanding made him the most wanted man in America. Not by the law, but by the very criminals the law could never touch. Before we continue, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tell me where you're listening from. Which city? Which state? The story of Mad Dog Coll touched every borough of New York, every back room where men made deals that shaped the city's underworld. Let me know if you're listening from one of those places where this history still echoes. To understand how an Irish kid from Gweedore became the architect of a campaign so depraved it united warring mafia families, we must go back to a winter morning in 1908 in County Donegal, Ireland, where a woman named Bridget Coll gave birth to her 5th child in a stone cottage that smelled of peat smoke and damp wool. The boy was named Sean. Vincent. He was born during a snowstorm so severe that the midwife couldn't reach the cottage until 2 days after the birth. Bridget Coll, delirious with fever, held the infant against her chest and sang to him in Irish, old songs about warriors and kings, about men who refused to bend. The boy's father, a fisherman named Donchad, was at sea when his son was born. He would drown 3 months later when his curragh capsized in a squall off Erinmore Island. Bridget never sang those songs again. In 1909, Bridget Coll boarded a ship bound for New York with 5 children and 8 pounds sterling. They arrived at Ellis Island on a Tuesday in March. The immigration officer couldn't pronounce Sean, so he wrote Vincent on the manifest. Bridget couldn't read English, so she didn't correct him. The family settled in a tenement on 11th Avenue in Hell's Kitchen, in a neighborhood where Irish immigrants lived 12 to a room and the smell of the slaughterhouses mixed with the smell of the Hudson River at low tide. Vincent Coll grew up in a world where violence was currency and silence was survival. His older brother, Peter, joined a street gang called the Gophers when Vincent was 7. Peter taught Vincent how to fight, how to take a punch without flinching, how to use a broken bottle, how to run. Their mother worked 16-hour shifts in a laundry on 10th Avenue. She came home smelling of lye and steam, her hands cracked and bleeding. She never asked her sons where they went or what they did. She knew, everyone knew. By the time Vincent was 12, he was running numbers for a bookmaker named Oni Madden. By 14, he was stealing cars and stripping them in a garage on 52nd Street. By 16, he had killed his first man, a dock worker who tried to shake down Peter for protection money. Vincent stabbed him 7 times in an alley behind a speakeasy called the Stork Club. He cleaned the blade on the man's coat, walked home, and ate dinner with his mother. She asked him why his knuckles were bruised. He told her he'd been in a fight at school. She nodded and served him more potatoes. What kind of boy becomes the kind of man who castrates his enemies and mails the evidence to their wives? What kind of mind calculates that humiliation is more devastating than death? And how does a culture that worships machismo and omerta respond when someone turns those very values into weapons against them? Vincent Coll understood something fundamental about the men he would later terrorize. Their power was performance. The respect they commanded, the fear they inspired, the empires they built, all of it rested on a foundation of perceived invincibility. A man could survive a bullet. A man could survive prison. But a man could not survive the knowledge that his wife had received a package containing proof of his ultimate degradation. Proof that he had been unmanned, literally and symbolically, before he died. Coll's education in this psychology began in 1926, when he went to work for Dutch Schultz, the beer baron of the Bronx. Schultz, born Arthur Flegenheimer, was a Jewish gangster who controlled the speakeasy trade north of 125th Street. He was brutal, efficient, and paranoid. He trusted no one, which is why he hired Vincent Coll. Coll was Irish, an outsider in the predominantly Italian and Jewish underworld. He had no family ties to exploit, no ethnic loyalty to leverage. He was a gun for hire, and Schultz liked that. Coll worked as Schultz's enforcer for 3 years. He collected debts, intimidated rivals, and occasionally killed people who needed killing. He was good at it. He was also learning. He watched how Schultz operated, how he played the Italians against the Irish, how he used information as leverage, how he made examples of people. Schultz once ordered Coll to beat a speakeasy owner who was late on a payment. Coll broke the man's legs with a tire iron in front of his wife and children. The man paid. Everyone paid after that. But Coll was also watching the Italians. In 1928, Schultz began negotiating with the Castellamarese family, a Sicilian clan that controlled the East Harlem rackets. The Castellamarese were old world, traditional. They believed in blood oaths and family honor. They looked down on the Jews and the Irish as mercenaries, men without culture, without history. Coll attended meetings as Schultz's bodyguard. He stood in the corner, silent, observing. He saw how the Italians carried themselves, the rituals they performed, the language they used. He saw how they touched their wives' photographs before a sit-down, how they kissed crucifixes before making a deal. He saw the architecture of their pride, and he saw its fault lines. In 1930, Vincent Coll broke with Dutch Schultz. The reasons are disputed. Some say Schultz refused to give Coll a bigger cut of the Harlem numbers racket. Some say Coll tried to freelance a kidnapping and Schultz found out. Some say it was simpler than that. Coll wanted to be his own boss, and Schultz didn't tolerate ambition in his employees. What is not disputed is what happened next. Coll declared war on Schultz. He assembled a crew of Irish gunmen, most of them Hell's Kitchen boys he'd grown up with. They called themselves the Coll Gang, though the newspapers would later call them the Mad Dog Gang, after Vincent's nickname. The nickname came from a prosecutor who said Coll had the eyes of a mad dog and the soul of a demon. Coll liked it. He had business cards printed with Mad Dog Coll embossed in gold letters. The war with Schultz was vicious. Coll's crew hijacked Schultz's beer trucks, bombed his speakeasies, and murdered his collectors. Schultz retaliated by putting a $50,000 bounty on Coll's head. The violence escalated. In July 1931, Coll's men opened fire on a group of Schultz's associates outside a social club in East Harlem. They missed their targets, but killed a 5-year-old boy named Michael Vengali, who was playing on the sidewalk. The newspapers called it the Baby Massacre. The public was outraged. Mayor Jimmy Walker demanded action. The police launched a manhunt. Coll went underground. He moved from safe house to safe house, never sleeping in the same place twice. He grew paranoid, erratic. He started drinking heavily, using cocaine. His crew began to fracture. Some of his men were arrested, some were killed, some just disappeared. Coll needed money, needed leverage, needed a way to turn the tide. That's when he decided to go after the Italians. Schultz had allies in the Castellamarese family. If Coll could hurt them, he could hurt Schultz. But more than that, Coll understood that the Italians were his real enemy. Schultz was just a symptom. The Italians controlled the infrastructure, the politicians, the judges, the cops. They were the system. And Coll, an Irish outsider, would never be allowed into that system. So he decided to destroy it. He began by studying his targets. He identified 11 lieutenants in the Castellamarese family, men who ran the family's operations in Harlem, the Bronx, and Brooklyn. He learned their routines, their habits, their weaknesses. He learned where they ate, where they drank, where they kept their mistresses, and he learned about their wives. The wives were important. In the Sicilian tradition, a man's wife was sacred, untouchable. She was the keeper of his honor, the mother of his children, the symbol of his legitimacy. To disrespect a man's wife was to disrespect the man himself, to challenge his ability to protect what was his. Coll understood this. He understood that in a culture where machismo was religion, emasculation was heresy. What followed was a campaign of terror so calculated, so grotesque, that it would become legend in the underworld. Between December 1931 and February 1932, Vincent Coll and his crew kidnapped 11 Castellamarese lieutenants. The abductions were surgical. The men were taken from their homes, their cars, their mistresses' apartments. They were taken in the middle of the night, in broad daylight, from crowded restaurants and empty streets. They were taken, and they disappeared. The families received no ransom demands. No bodies were found. For weeks, the wives waited. Some hired private investigators. Some went to the police, though they knew the police wouldn't help. Some went to the church, lit candles, prayed to saints. The Castellamarese bosses put out feelers, sent emissaries, tried to negotiate. Coll didn't respond. He was silent, and in that silence, fear grew. Then the packages started arriving. The first package, the one the postal inspector opened on February 8, 1932, was addressed to Mrs. Salvatore Maranzano, wife of a Castellamarese capo who ran a loan sharking operation in the Bronx. The note attached to the jar read, "Salvatore died on his knees. He cried for his mother. He is no longer a man." The handwriting was neat, almost elegant. The stationery was expensive, cream-colored, watermarked. It was the kind of paper a gentleman would use to write a letter of condolence. Mrs. Maranzano did not open the package herself. Her son, a boy of 14, opened it. He vomited on the kitchen floor. Mrs. Maranzano called her husband's boss, a man named Joe Masseria. Masseria sent 2 men to collect the package. They brought it to a warehouse in Red Hook, where Masseria examined it personally. He held the jar up to the light, studied the contents, read the note. Then he placed the jar on a table, sat down, and didn't speak for 20 minutes. The other packages arrived over the next 3 days. Each was delivered by the postal service. Each bore the same careful wrapping. Each contained the same cargo. The notes varied in their cruelty. One read, "He begged me to kill him quickly. I did not." Another, "Your husband was a coward and a weakling. You are a widow, but you were always alone." A third, "I have taken from him what he valued most. Now you know what he was worth." The wives did not speak to each other. They did not gather, did not mourn together. The shame was too great. In Sicilian culture, a woman's honor was tied to her husband's honor. If he was disgraced, she was disgraced. If he was unmanned, she was unmarriageable, untouchable, a ghost. Some of the wives left New York. Some entered convents. One threw herself from the roof of her apartment building on Mulberry Street. The police ruled it a suicide. The newspapers didn't cover it. The Castellamarese family was in chaos. Joe Masseria called a meeting of the Commission, the ruling body of the New York Mafia. He demanded action. The other families, Luciano, Profaci, Bonanno, were horrified, but also wary. Coll had done something unprecedented. He had violated the most sacred taboo of the underworld. He had involved the families. He had sent the evidence to the wives. He had made the private public, the shameful undeniable. Salvatore Maranzano, the head of the Castellamarese family, stood before the commission and made a vow. He said, "This Irish dog has dishonored us. He has dishonored our wives, our families, our blood. He must be erased, not killed, erased. His name must be forgotten. His grave must be unmarked. His memory must be ash." The commission agreed. A contract was issued. Every family in New York contributed men and money. The bounty on Coll's head was raised to $100,000, an unheard-of sum. Informants were activated, cops were bribed, safe houses were raided. Coll's crew was hunted down one by one. Some were killed in shootouts. Some were arrested and disappeared into Sing Sing. Some turned informant and vanished into witness protection. But Coll himself remained elusive. He moved through the city like a ghost, never staying in one place, never using the same car twice, never trusting anyone. He grew more paranoid, more violent. He killed 2 of his own men because he suspected they were informants. He started carrying a Thompson submachine gun everywhere, even to the bathroom. He stopped sleeping. His eyes, always intense, became wild, feral. The newspapers called him Mad Dog, and the name fit. In the end, it wasn't the mafia that found him. It was a woman. Her name was Lieut Kreisberger. She was a showgirl, a dancer at a speakeasy called the Hotsy Totsy Club. Coll had met her in 1930, before the war with Schultz, before the packages, before everything. She was beautiful, blonde, with green eyes and a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. Coll was obsessed with her. He wrote her letters, sent her flowers, bought her jewelry. She tolerated him because he was dangerous, and dangerous men were exciting. But she didn't love him. She loved money. In February 1932, Lieut Kreisberger was arrested for prostitution. She was facing 6 months in the Women's House of Detention. A detective named Michael Fiaschetti offered her a deal. Give up Coll, and the charges would disappear. Lottie didn't hesitate. She told Fiaschetti that Coll called her every night at 11 p.m. from a payphone. She didn't know where he was calling from, but she knew he would call. On the night of February 8, 1932, the same day the first package arrived, Lieut Kreisberger answered her phone at 11 p.m. Coll's voice was tense, clipped. He asked her to meet him at a drugstore on 23rd Street and 8th Avenue. She agreed. Then she called Detective Fiaschetti. Fiaschetti didn't involve the police. He called Oni Madden, the Irish mob boss who controlled Hell's Kitchen. Madden, in turn, called the Castellamaris family. A team was assembled: 4 men, 2 cars, Thompson submachine guns, and a single objective. At 11:47 p.m., Vincent Coll entered the London chemist's drugstore on 23rd Street. He walked to the phone booth in the back, closed the door, and dialed Lottie's number. The phone rang twice. Then the door of the drugstore opened. The 4 men entered quickly, professionally. They didn't speak. They didn't hesitate. They raised their Thompsons and opened fire. The phone booth disintegrated. Glass exploded. Wood splintered. Coll's body was hit 15 times. He died standing up, the phone receiver still pressed to his ear. The men walked out, got into their cars, and drove away. The entire event took less than 30 seconds. By the time the police arrived, the drugstore was empty except for the owner, who was hiding behind the counter, and Vincent Coll, who was slumped in the phone booth, his blood pooling on the floor, the receiver dangling from its cord. The newspapers called it the Valentine's Day Massacre, though it happened 6 days before Valentine's Day. The police called it a gang killing and closed the case within a week. No arrests were made. No witnesses came forward. The phone booth was removed and destroyed. The drugstore was sold and demolished. Within a year, there was no physical evidence that Vincent Coll had ever been there. But the packages remained. The 11 jars, each containing its grotesque cargo, were never recovered. The wives who received them never spoke of them publicly. The Castellamares family never acknowledged that the abductions had happened. The commission issued a decree. Vincent Coll's name was not to be spoken. His grave was to remain unmarked. His story was to be forgotten. And for decades, it was. But stories like this don't die. They metastasize. They become legend, myth, cautionary tale. In the years after Coll's death, the story of the packages circulated in the underworld, whispered in back rooms and social clubs, told to new recruits as a lesson in what happens when you violate the code. The details changed with each telling. Some said there were 12 packages, some said 20. Some said Coll had sent the wives photographs, videos, recordings of their husbands' final moments. Some said he had kept the bodies, displayed them in a warehouse, invited people to view them. None of it was true, but the truth didn't matter. What mattered was the story, the idea, the fear. Vincent Coll had done something that couldn't be undone. He had weaponized shame in a culture that valued honor above life. He had turned the mafia's own code against itself. And in doing so, he had created a legend that would outlive him. In 1951, a reporter named Burton Turkis published a book called Murder, Inc. In it, he devoted a chapter to Vincent Coll. Turkis had been a prosecutor in Brooklyn, had worked cases involving the mafia, had interviewed informants and witnesses. He wrote about the packages, about the wives, about the jars. He wrote that Coll had been the most hated man in the history of organized crime, that his death had been celebrated in every Italian social club in New York. But Turkis also wrote something else. He wrote that in the weeks before Coll's death, a priest named Father Vincent Ahern had visited him in a safe house in the Bronx. Father Ahern was an Irish Catholic priest who ran a mission in Hell's Kitchen, who ministered to gangsters and prostitutes and addicts. He had known Coll since childhood, had baptized him, had tried to save him. According to Turkis, Father Ahern asked Coll why he had done it. Why the castrations? Why the packages? Why the wives? Coll's answer, as reported by Turkis, was this: because they needed to know. They needed to know that their husbands were nothing, that all their power, all their respect, all their honor, it was a lie. I wanted them to hold the truth in their hands. I wanted them to see it, smell it, know it. I wanted them to understand that everything they believed was a fairy tale. Father Ahern asked him if he felt remorse. Coll said, "Remorse is for men who believe in God. I believe in nothing." Father Ahern left the safe house and never saw Coll again. 3 days later, Coll was dead. The story, as Turkis told it, was almost certainly apocryphal. There is no record of Father Ahern visiting Coll, no corroboration, no evidence. But like the packages themselves, the truth didn't matter. The story had a function. It explained the inexplicable. It gave motive to madness. It turned Vincent Coll from a psychopath into a philosopher of violence. A man who understood that in a world built on illusions, the cruelest thing you can do is reveal the truth. But was it the truth? In 1973, a historian named Virgil Peterson published a book called The Mob, 200 Years of Organized Crime in New York. Peterson had access to FBI files, police records, commission transcripts. He wrote about the Castellammarise War, about the packages, about Coll. But he also wrote about something that had been overlooked, something that changed the entire narrative. According to Peterson, the 11 men who were abducted and castrated were not random targets. They were informants. Peterson's evidence was circumstantial but compelling. He cited FBI memos from 1931 that mentioned several Castellammarise soldiers providing information to federal authorities. He cited police reports that noted unusual cooperation from Italian sources in Harlem and the Bronx. He cited testimony from a commission meeting in 1932, where Joe Masseria accused traitors within the family of leaking information to the Irish. If Peterson was correct, then Vincent Coll was not a mad dog. He was an executioner. The castrations were not random acts of sadism. They were punishments, symbolic and literal, for the ultimate betrayal. The packages were not sent to terrorize innocent wives. They were sent to expose guilty husbands, to reveal their cowardice, their disloyalty, their willingness to betray the family to save themselves. In this version of the story, Coll was not violating the code. He was enforcing it. But Peterson's theory raises more questions than it answers. If the 11 men were informants, who told Coll? How did an Irish outsider gain access to intelligence that the Castellammarise family itself didn't have? And if Coll was acting as an enforcer, why did the commission want him dead? One possibility is that Coll was working for someone inside the family, someone who wanted to purge the informants without taking public responsibility, someone who could use Coll as a weapon and then discard him, someone who benefited from the chaos, the fear, the consolidation of power that followed. That someone, according to some historians, was Salvatore Maranzano. Maranzano was the head of the Castellammarise family, the man who vowed to erase Coll's name from history. But Maranzano was also a strategist, a student of Julius Caesar, a man who understood that power is built on fear and maintained through spectacle. In 1931, Maranzano was consolidating his control over the New York Mafia. He was eliminating rivals, absorbing territories, restructuring the commission. He needed loyalty. He needed to send a message. What better message than the packages? If Maranzano had identified the informants within his own family, he couldn't kill them himself. That would look like paranoia, like weakness. But if an outsider killed them, if that outsider humiliated them in a way that made their betrayal undeniable, then Maranzano could position himself as the avenger, the protector, the strong man who restored honor. And then, once the message was sent, once the informants were dead and the wives were shamed and the family was terrified into loyalty, Maranzano could eliminate the outsider. He could have Coll killed and take credit for restoring order. He could be both the architect and the hero. This theory is speculative. There is no hard evidence that Maranzano and Coll were working together. But there are suggestive details. Coll's crew was never able to penetrate the Castellammari's family's inner circle, yet they knew exactly where to find the 11 lieutenants. The abductions were too precise, too surgical, to be the work of a rogue Irish gang. And after Coll's death, Maranzano's power within the commission grew exponentially. Within 6 months, he had restructured the entire mafia, creating the 5-family system that still exists today. But Maranzano's triumph was short-lived. In September 1931, 7 months after Coll's death, Maranzano was assassinated in his office by a team of gunmen sent by Lucky Luciano. Luciano, who had been Maranzano's underboss, had grown tired of the old man's autocratic style, his obsession with Roman history, his belief that he was destined to be the boss of bosses. Luciano wanted a more democratic structure, a commission where power was shared, where decisions were made collectively. Luciano succeeded. He restructured the mafia, eliminated the position of boss of bosses, and created the modern commission. And in doing so, he erased Maranzano's legacy just as Maranzano had erased Coll's. But the packages remained, the story remained, the question remained. In 1998, a journalist named Selwyn Robb published a book called 5 Families: The Rise, Decline, and Resurgence of America's Most Powerful Mafia Empires. In it, Robb interviewed several retired mobsters, men who had been active in the 1930s and 40s, men who remembered the Castellammari's War, the packages, the legend of Mad Dog Coll. One of these men, identified only as Tony, told Robb a story. Tony said that in 1947, he had been initiated into the Bonanno family. As part of his initiation, he was taken to a warehouse in Red Hook, the same warehouse where Joe Masseria had examined the first package in 1932. In the basement of that warehouse, Tony said, there was a room. And in that room, preserved in formaldehyde, were 11 jars. Tony said the jars were kept as a reminder, a warning, a piece of history. He said that every new member of the family was brought to that room and told the story of Vincent Coll, told what happens when you betray the family, told what happens when you violate the code. Robb asked Tony if he believed the jars were real, if they actually contained what they were supposed to contain. Tony said, I don't know. I didn't look too close. But real or not, it didn't matter. The story was real. The fear was real. That's what mattered. Robb tried to verify Tony's story. He contacted the Bonanno family, the NYPD, the FBI. No one would confirm or deny the existence of the room, the jars, the ritual. The warehouse in Red Hook had been demolished in 1952. There were no records, no photographs, no evidence. But the story persisted. In 2003, a documentary filmmaker named Mark Levin made a film called Godfathers and Sons about the legacy of organized crime in New York. Levin interviewed the grandchildren of mobsters, the children of informants, the widows of men who had been killed in gang wars. One of these widows was a woman named Maria Genovese, whose husband had been a soldier in the Luciano family in the 1930s. Maria told Levin that her husband had once told her about the packages. He had said that the story was true, that Coll had sent the jars, that the wives had received them. But he had also said something else. he had said that the jars were empty. According to Maria's husband, Coll had never actually castrated anyone. The jars contained animal organs, pig testicles purchased from a butcher in the Bronx. The notes were real, the packages were real, but the contents were fake. It was a bluff, a psychological operation, a mind game designed to terrorize the Castellammaris family into believing something that had never happened. And it worked. The families believed it. The wives believed it. The commission believed it. And because they believed it, it became true. The men were dead. The wives were shamed. The family was in chaos. The reality didn't matter. The belief did. Levin asked Maria if her husband had any proof, any evidence that the jars were fake. Maria said, "He said Coll told him. Right before Coll died, he called my husband, told him it was all a trick, told him to spread the word after he was gone. But my husband never did. He was too afraid. He said if the families found out it was fake, they'd look like fools. And you don't make the mafia look like fools and live." Levin tried to corroborate Maria's story. He couldn't. Maria's husband had died in 1987. There were no records of a phone call between him and Coll. There was no evidence that they had ever met. But the story, like all the others, persisted. So what is the truth? Was Vincent Coll a sadistic psychopath who castrated 11 men and sent the evidence to their wives? Was he an enforcer working for Salvatore Maranzano, eliminating informants and sending a message? Was he a con artist who faked the entire thing, who understood that in a world built on fear, the appearance of atrocity is as powerful as the atrocity itself? Or was he all of these things? A psychopath and an enforcer and a con artist, a man who understood that violence is theater, that power is perception, that in the underworld, the story you tell is more important than the truth you live. The answer, like the jars themselves, remains elusive. What we know for certain is this: Vincent Coll was born in Ireland in 1908 and died in New York in 1932. He worked for Dutch Schultz, broke with him, and declared war on the Irish and Italian underworld. He was called Mad Dog by the press and feared by the mafia. He was killed in a phone booth on 23rd Street by men who were never identified, never arrested, never punished. We know that 11 men associated with the Castellammaris family disappeared between December 1931 and February 1932. We know that their wives received packages. We know that the packages caused chaos, fear, and shame. We know that the commission issued a contract on Coll, that the bounty was unprecedented, that his death was celebrated. We know that his grave is unmarked, that his name was erased from the official histories of the mafia, that for decades, speaking his name was forbidden. And we know that despite all of this, the story survived. It survived in whispers and rumors, in books and documentaries, in the memories of old men and the nightmares of widows. It survived because it was too perfect, too terrible, too instructive to forget. Vincent Coll understood something that most criminals never learn: that in a world built on honor and fear, the greatest weapon is not the gun or the knife or the bomb. It is shame. It is the ability to strip a man of his dignity, to expose his weakness, to make his humiliation public and undeniable. He understood that you can kill a man and make him a martyr, but you can humiliate a man and make him a ghost. The packages, real or fake, were not about violence. They were about narrative. They were about controlling the story, shaping the perception, weaponizing belief. Coll knew that the mafia's power rested on a myth of invincibility, of honor, of masculine dominance. And he knew that the fastest way to destroy a myth is to make it ridiculous. Whether he actually castrated those men or simply convinced everyone that he had, the result was the same. The Castellammare's family was humiliated. The wives were shamed. The commission was forced to act. And Vincent Coll, a 23-year-old Irish kid from Hell's Kitchen, became the most feared man in New York for 11 weeks, and then he was erased. But erasure, as we have seen, is not the same as forgetting. The Mafia tried to erase Coll, tried to make him a non-person, a ghost, a cautionary tale told in whispers. But in trying to erase him, they made him immortal. They made him a legend. They made him the man who did the thing that could not be done, who violated the code that could not be violated, who turned the Mafia's own mythology against itself. And in doing so, they proved his point. The power of the Mafia, like all power, is a story. It is a narrative of strength, of honor, of inevitability. It is a performance, a ritual, a shared delusion. And when someone exposes that delusion, when someone reveals that the emperor has no clothes, or in this case, that the capo has no testicles, the entire structure trembles. Vincent Coll was killed not because he was a threat to the Mafia's operations, but because he was a threat to the Mafia's story. He had to be erased, not because of what he did, but because of what he represented. The idea that the code could be broken, that the myth could be shattered, that the fear could be turned around. The Mafia killed Vincent Coll in a phone booth on a cold February night in 1932. But they couldn't kill the story. They couldn't kill the question. And the question is this: in a world where power is performance, where honor is mythology, where violence is theater, what happens when someone calls the bluff? What happens when someone reveals that the thing we fear most is not the monster, but the idea of the monster? What happens when someone shows us that the jars might be empty, that the notes might be lies, that the entire edifice of fear and respect and omerta is built on nothing more than our willingness to believe? Vincent Coll, whether he knew it or not, asked that question. And the Mafia, in killing him, in erasing him, in trying to bury the story, answered it. They answered it by proving that the story is all that matters. That belief is more powerful than truth. That in the underworld, as in the world above, we are governed not by facts, but by narratives, not by reality, but by the stories we tell ourselves about reality. The 11 jars, real or fake, are somewhere. In a warehouse basement, in a police evidence locker, in a landfill, in the river, in the collective unconscious of everyone who has ever heard the story and shuddered. They exist because we believe they exist. They are powerful because we believe they are powerful. And Vincent Coll, dead for 90 years, erased from history, buried in an unmarked grave, remains more alive than most of the men who killed him. Because his story, unlike theirs, asks a question that cannot be answered, that haunts us, that forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that everything we believe about power and honor and fear might be nothing more than a jar of pig testicles and a well-written note. The truth, like the jars, like Vincent Coll himself, remains missing. And maybe that's the point. Maybe some stories aren't meant to have endings. Maybe some questions aren't meant to have answers. Maybe the only thing we can know for certain is that in the space between what happened and what we believe happened, in the gap between the truth and the story, monsters are born. And sometimes those monsters mail pieces of themselves to the people who loved them, just to see what they'll do.